Hello everyone. From this video, I am going to explain how to prepare research proposal presentation. The research proposal presentation should be based on the research proposal which you have prepared. So in fact, the research proposal is a detailed document which highlighted the research title and the research question objectives. At the same time, the research proposal clearly indicates the way that we are going to conduct your research during the scheduled time period. So therefore, once you prepared your research proposal, it is required to get it approved and get it confirmed from a panel of experts, right? So that is a mandatory requirement for both undergraduate and the postgraduate students, right? So therefore, this research proposal presentation, that's very crucial component of this research journey, because so without presenting your research proposal, it is very difficult for you to take the approval and the confirmation for your research proposal, right? So at the same time, since this research proposal, which is mainly based on the proposal presentation is mainly based on the research proposal, the outline of the research proposal is exactly same as the research proposal structure. But there can be some deviation, but still quite similar to the structure of the research proposal. So therefore, so let me start discussion with this the outline of the research proposal presentation. Right. So as you can see, so this is the outline of the research proposal presentation. So different academic institutions, different universities, so they may have different and specific uh, outline or the structures, but what I have highlighted here is common outline for a research proposal presentation, right? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to explain this outline one by one, and then I'll be taking one example that's a prepared research proposal presentation to elaborate each and every component of this research proposal presentation, right? The first component is the introduction, right? So introduction is the place where we are going to introduce our research to the audience. At the same time, we are going to provide some background information. And then the literature review. The literature review critically evaluate the existing body of knowledge, providing the kind of additional and technical background to the research. And then the problem statement, which is much more important. The problem statement clearly provide the kind of very good background for the research problems, right? And then after highlighting the problem statement, you can indicate the research question and the objectives, and then the significance of the study. So this point is very important, the significance of the study. So this is the place where we are going to highlight the originality of the research, right? So what is the different, what are differences of our study from the previous literature? So therefore, this component is very important at this proposal presentation stage. And the next one is the conceptual framework, which indicates the key variables that we are going to work with, along with the relationship among these variables. And then the hypothesis. The hypothesis technically indicates the tentative research, tentative answers for the research question. So therefore, this hypothesis should be elaborated in this research proposal presentation. And then the operationalization. The operationalization indicates how to measure the variables highlighted in the framework. And then the methodology, which indicates clearly the way that we are going to conduct the research. And then we have to highlight the outline of the thesis. The outline of the thesis in the sense, right? So this is just the research proposal presentation, and then during the scheduled time period, you have to compile your thesis, and then what are the component? What should be the first chapter? What should be the second chapter, and so on? You have to outline the chapters of the thesis, and then expected research publication, right? Once you complete this research, you can publish your research, and then you have to highlight, okay, so what are the expected research publication based on this research study. And then the time frame indicates a calendar. It implies that how we are going to plan your scheduled time period to accomplish this research outcome. And then the references, you have to highlight all the references, all the sources that you have cited when you are preparing this research proposal. Right. So now, so we'll take one examples, the prepared research proposal, and then so I'm going to explain each step one by one, right, along with the prepared research proposal. Right. When you're preparing your research proposal, the first the slide should be allocated for the research title, right? You have to very clearly indicate so what is the title. At the same time, your name, the index number, and then the department and the university details should be included there. But very specifically, the title of the research should be indicated, right? And then, so this is the title that I have selected for this discussion: a study on analyzing the impact of oil price on economic growth of OECD countries, a dynamic panel data analysis, right? So this is the title that I have taken. Then, so I'm going to continue this discussion based on this title. Then the next is, once you allocate the first slide for the title, in the second slide, you have to indicate the outline of the presentation, right? Here I have taken the same outline as I highlighted in the previously. So therefore, let me start with the introduction. So this introduction, right, the introduction of the research proposal presentation should be attractive one, should be comprehensive, and should be very specific, right? Because this, using this introduction, you are going to provide some background information for the study. You are going to introduce this study to the audience, to the panel of experts, right? So therefore, this introduction is very important, right? Because now this, the focus research here is that's based on that focus on the oil price and the economic growth, right? So let me read it out how I have compiled this introduction, right? The first sentence is energy is a key driver of global economy, essential for agriculture, industry, service, regardless of a country's economy, right? So now we generally focus on the energy. So what is the importance of energy? Now move to the second one. Now we have much more focus on oil. Initially, we have taken the energy and then oil. The oil remains a crucial component in all global economic sectors, despite the prominence of the renewable energy sources like wind, solar, and nuclear power. See, so even though the renewable energy, there's a huge discussion on this renewable energy, but still the oil is much more important. We are emphasizing, we are highlighting the importance of oil. Why? Because we are going to study on the oil price. And then take the third point, we are focusing on the geographical location that we are going to base, because we are going to study on the OECD countries. Then in the third sentence, what we have done is we have highlighted the importance of oil for the OECD countries, right? So similarly, this introduction should be planned in a way that, right, in order to provide a very comprehensive but specific understanding to the reader, right? So therefore, my recommendation is, before you are going to write this introduction, right, at least read 5 research papers and their introduction related to your research, and then, right, you can study the writing style, right, you can study how they have compiled the sentences, how they have combined the, the facts and figures, and then you can start writing this introduction. At the same time, if you need, you can include some illustrations, the graph, and some statistics, right, to justify your research idea, right? Here, what I have done is I have graph, right, the oil consumption of OECD countries and the average oil consumption of the world, right? So this is the average oil consumption of the world, and this is the average oil consumption of the OECD countries, right? Because I wanted to highlight that OECD countries consume much more oil than the world average, right? So similarly, you can do this kind of interpretation during this introduction session, right? So therefore, this introduction session should be written in a way that, right, you need to, the take the attention of the panel members, right? You need to highlight that this study is worthwhile to conduct, right? So therefore, this introduction section is much more important. So therefore, please be careful when you are writing this, because so this is the very first slide of your presentation, right? And then the literature review, right? After the introduction, we are going to highlight the literature review, right? The literature review indicates critical evaluation of the existing body of knowledge, right? Take this point very clearly. The literature review is not a summary, this is a synthesis. But the majority of the students, what they are going to do is they are going to define the key terms of the research, right? For example, what is oil price? What is economic growth? Right? So what is OECD countries? Right? Those things should not be included in under the literature review, right? So under the literature review, what you should do is you should read, the relevant papers and then critically evaluate the concept and the key information in these papers, and then synthesize them, and then start writing the literature review, right? Because at the end of the literature review, you have to highlight the research gap, right? Because this research gap should be emerged through the literature review, right? If you are not going to compile this literature review as a synthesis, it is very difficult for you to highlight the research gap, right? Maybe you can allocate 1 or 2 slides for the literature review, but however, at the end of the literature review, you have to highlight the research gap. See here, I have highlighted my research gap, right? Conflicting findings. Because when you are going through the literature, right? When you are going through the literature, you can very easily recognize what are the research gap in the literature, right? Because there are some empirical studies, so they have ended up with mixed findings or conflicting findings, right? For example, align with this study which I have conducted here, right? Some of the studies, so they have observed there is a negative relationship between oil price and economic growth, right? But there are some other studies, so they have observed positive relationship, right? At the same time, there are some other studies, Cheng and Wong in 2003, right? They confirm that there is no significant relationship between oil price and economic growth, right? So similarly, right, when you are critically evaluating and synthesizing the existing body of knowledge, right, then you can have very comprehensive understanding about, right, the knowledge, the existing knowledge, right? From that existing knowledge, you can find out this kind of research gap, conflicting findings, or maybe some methodological gap, evidence gap, right? Empirical gaps, right? So those gaps should be discovered from the literature review. So therefore, the literature review should be very important in this research proposal presentation because you are going to locate, right? You are going to locate your research idea in the existing body of knowledge. So that's why we need this literature review importantly, right? Then from the literature review, we have highlighted, okay, so these are the research gaps, and then we can move to the problem statement, right? Then you can move to the problem statement, right? Because this problem statement provide a background for the research question, right? The problem statements, they are to provide a background for the research problem. So otherwise, the problem statement provide a very clear justification for the research problem. When someone is going through the problem statement, right, he or she should be able to imagine, okay, these are the research question of this study, right? Let me go through this sentence here. Right? Analysis often focus on oil price growth nexuses. However, the impact of oil price on economic growth should be analyzed through various channels directly related to the economic growth. See that sentence. Right? This sentence clearly indicates that there can be numerous studies which address the relationship between oil price and economic growth. But however, right, still there's a vacuum for the studies which address the impact of oil price on economic growth through different channel variables. Right? So therefore, what we are going to do from this study is that at the same time, see, also I have highlighted some methodological issues. The methodological issues related to the time series and cross-section analysis, right? It implies that the most of the studies, the most of the previous scholars, so they have applied time series and cross-sectional analysis, right? But this time series and cross-section analysis, so they have some of their weaknesses. We can't generalize the results. In terms of the cross-section analysis, there is an endogeneity issue, right? So therefore, in this problem statement, we are going to highlight this kind of issues, right? Because those things can be used to justify our research question, right? Then we have highlighted the research gap from the literature review, and then we have highlighted the problem statement. Then let's move to the research question, right? So you can clearly indicate the research question based on the problem statement. The research question here is, what is the impact of oil price on economic growth through channel variables in the context of OECD countries? See, this research question is complete and specific. What is the impact of oil price on economic growth through channel variables, right, in the context of OECD countries? Then see, so this is the problem statement, right? So this problem statement and then the research question. Literature review, from the literature review you can take the research gap, and then the problem statement, and then the research question, right? You need to ensure this sequence, the order, and then we can move to the research objectives, right? The objective of this research is to examine, right? When you are writing research objectives, you have to use some specific terms: to examine, to analyze, to observe, to model, to quantify, to compare, right? Here, to examine the impact of oil price on economic growth of 38 OECD countries over the period of 2020 to 2000 to 2020 through four channel variables. Here, this objective is very much clear, right? We are going to focus on 38 OECD countries during this time period and focusing on these channel variables because we are going to examine the impact of economic growth, the impact of oil price on economic growth through these four channel variables such as real interest rate, exchange rate, then the government expenditure and investment. Right? Again, make sure that you have ensured the sequence. Gap, problem statement, research question, and the research objectives. Right? Okay, so let's move to the significance of the study. This point is very much important because the most of the panel members, the most of the experts in the panel, right? So they are going to question, right? So what is the originality of the research, right? So what is the contribution of the research? How your research is different from the existing body of knowledge. So therefore, you have to very clearly highlight the significance of your study, right? So therefore, take the first sentence here. The majority of studies have addressed the direct impact of oil price on economic growth, ignoring its indirect impacts through different channels. Right? See, again, we are highlighting the same fact. There can be some studies which address the oil price and economic growth, but just the direct. But they haven't addressed how this oil price can affect economic growth through the channel variables, right? See the contribution of the study in the second statement, right? The present study address how oil price affects economic growth through different channel variable, right? The present study addresses how oil price affect economic growth through different channel variables such as real interest rate, exchange rate, the government expenditure and investment. This is the novelty of this is the originality of this is the contribution of this study. Not only that, there's another contribution. There's another contribution to the methodology, right? Application of improved methodology, right? Because the in the literature they have applied the time series and the cross-section analysis, but this study, right, we are going to overcome the weaknesses attached to the time series analysis and the cross-section analysis by incorporating dynamic panel data analysis based on generalized method of movement, right? So this is the contribution of this is the significance of the current study, right? Similar to this, when you are presenting your research proposal presentation, you also need to highlight, so what is the originality, so what is the contribution, right? How your research different from others' research. You have to emphasize these points because this is how you can cultivate, right? You can cultivate your research, right, in this existing body of knowledge. So therefore, this point is very much important, the significance of the study, right? So let's move to the next step of the proposal outline. Then the conceptual framework. This conceptual framework clearly indicates the variables that we are going to deal with during this research, right? At the same time, this framework highlight interrelationships between and among the variables, right? So therefore, this variable is very much important, right? When you are presenting your research proposal presentation, it is a must to include this conceptual framework, right? Here we have the oil price and then the exchange rate and then the real interest rate and the government expenditure and the investment and the economic growth, right? But more generally, economic growth is the dependent variable and oil price is the independent variable, right? Because we are going to analyze the impact of oil price on economic growth. So therefore, this is the dependent variable and this is the independent variable. But we are going to examine this relationship through these channel variables, right? So this, when you are going to focus on this conceptual framework, sometimes it is difficult for you to create your own framework. Then what you should do is you can search the literature, right? You can take someone else, some other scholars, the conceptual framework, and you can use that, right? Or otherwise, you can take someone else conceptual framework and you can modify it. You can add and drop some variables and you can revise, you can modify the existing framework, right? Or thirdly, you can create your own framework, right? If there is no any proper framework available in the literature, then you have to create your own framework, right? So therefore, you can use, right, these three options to create conceptual framework because this framework is very much important in this empirical research, right? Once you create this conceptual framework, then you can move to the hypothesis. Hypotheses are the tentative answers for the research question, right? At the same time, this hypothesis, right, uh, should be emerged from the conceptual framework, right? There are four hypotheses in this study, right? How oil price affect economic growth through the exchange rate, right? You can go through this hypothesis. The first hypothesis, oil price affect economic growth through exchange rate. Because we are providing some tentative answers for the research questions. The second hypothesis, right? So this is the first hypothesis then. Oil price affect economic growth through exchange rate. Then the second hypothesis is oil price affect economic growth through the real interest rate, right? And then the third one is oil price affects economic growth through government expenditure. And the fourth one is oil price affect economic growth through investment, right? So therefore, all these hypotheses should be should be aligned with this conceptual framework, right? Then create the conceptual framework and then highlight the hypothesis, right? and then the operationalization. Framework, hypothesis, and then the operationalization. Operationalization clearly indicates, right, how to measure the variables in the framework, right? Because in this framework we have uh, how many variables? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, right? Altogether 6 variables, right? And then we have to very clearly indicate what are the descriptions of the variable, right? So therefore, in this operationalization, you can take the variable name and then the description, and then so what are the possible data sources for this variables? For example, here we have the log of real GDP, right? Then this is the variable name, the logarithm of real gross domestic production, and the data source is world development indicators. Similarly, you can list all the variable names along with their descriptions, and also you can highlight the possible data sources. But this operationalization is for, because this study based on secondary data, right? This study based on secondary data, so therefore this operationalization is a bit different from the operationalization that you can use for the primary data. So assume that you are going to conduct a research based on primary data, then operationalization should be a bit changed, right? Because in some studies which uses the primary data, you have to create some variable, right? For example, maybe the living standard. So if you take the living standard, you can't directly measure the living standard. There can be some dimensions linked with the living standard. For example, assume that there are 3 dimensions in the living standard. But if we take the 1 dimension, there can be 2 other indicated. So therefore, in this research proposal presentation, if you are going to use primary data, then operationalization should be the variable names, and then the dimensions, and then the indicators, right? And then the measurement scale. For example, maybe under the measurement scale, you can use the Likert scale, right? You can use the Likert scale. So therefore, the best ways to create this operationalization is, again, right, you can refer to the literature. You can find some good research papers and, right, study how they have compiled their operationalization, right? How they have used their dimensions, indicators, and the measurement scales, right? So therefore, it is very important to indicate this operationalization. This slide is a must for the research proposal presentation, right? Where you are going to highlight all the variables along with their descriptions and the measurement scales, the data sources, right? Everything should be included under this operationalization very clearly and comprehensively, right? So let's move to the next stage of the proposal presentation, the methodology. This methodology clearly elaborates how you are going to conduct your research, right? So under this methodology, you have to very clearly indicate 3 sections: research design, data collection, and then the data analysis, right? Research design. This study is a quantitative study, so therefore I have indicated quantitative research design. If you are going to apply qualitative research, then that should be qualitative research design. But if you are going to combine both quantitative and qualitative, then that's a mixed research design. So therefore, you have to very clearly indicate what is your research design. And then data collection. As I mentioned previously, this study based on secondary data. So therefore, I have included that secondary data will be collected secondary data will be collected for 38 OECD countries over the period of 2000 to 2020, right? Because I'm going to use secondary data. But assume that, right, you are going to use the primary data. If you are going to use the primary data, data collection procedure will be bit complex, right? Then you have to select where is the study area, what is the population, right? Right? If the population is known or unknown, right? Right? Simply whether the sample frame is available or not. If the sample frame is available, you can go with probability sampling or random sampling. But if the if the sample frame is not available, then you have to go with non-probability sampling. Then, right, again, you have to select the study area, you have to highlight the population, right, and then, so what is the sample size, right? If it is population is known, then what is sample size? Then you can determine sample size based on the sample size calculator, or maybe based on the Morgan table, right? Once the sample size highlighted, then you have to very clearly mention that what is the sample, what kind of sampling technique that you are going to apply. Whether simple random sampling, whether stratified sampling, whether purposive sampling, whether convenience sampling, you have to very clearly highlight that under this data collection procedure, right? At the same time, right, how we are going to collect the data. If you are going to collect quantitative data, maybe through a questionnaire-based survey, right? If you are going to collect qualitative data, maybe through the focus group discussions or the key informant interviews. So then under this data collection procedure, everything should be elaborated during the research proposal presentation, right? Specifically, the panel members raise so many questions regarding your sample, population, right, the sampling techniques and data collection procedure. So therefore, please be ready with this section. This section is pretty much important. At the same time, so this section is that will be highly questioned by the members, right? Then move to the data analysis, right? So data analysis, if you are going to, if your study is quantitative research, then you can apply descriptive analysis plus the econometric analysis. You can use the descriptive analysis, simply the charts and the graph, just to explain the sample properties, right? But for your main analysis, you can apply econometric analysis or the statistical analysis like correlation analysis, the regression analysis, panel data analysis, or the structural equation modeling, right? That depends on your research design. But if you are going to apply qualitative research approach, then the data analytic techniques might be different. Maybe the thematic analysis, content analysis, right? So therefore, that based entirely based on your research approach, your research design. But anyhow, right, under the methodology, this data analysis should be very clearly highlighted. For example, assume that you are going to use a regression analysis, then the regression equation should be indicated. You can see here I have indicated the regression equation, right? The regression equation very clearly indicated along with their variable descriptions, right? Okay, so let's move to the outline of the thesis, right? This outline of the thesis should elaborate, right, what are the chapters of the thesis. Because when you are presenting this outline of the thesis, right, you are providing some additional information to the panel that you are confident on this research, right? You know how to conduct this research, right? You know the process of this research. So therefore, it is important for you to include this slide into your research proposal presentation, the outline of the thesis. Right? For example, the first chapter that can be allocated for the introduction, while second one is describing the literature review. The third one is allocated for the methodology, and the fourth one is for the results and discussion. And finally, you can conclude the conclusion and the recommendations, right? So therefore, include this chapter as well to gain some extra attention from the panel, right? And then the expected research publication. This one is also important to get some extra attention from the panel. Why? Because you are presenting this research proposal to compile the academic proposal, academic research, maybe for your undergraduate or maybe for your postgraduate, right? But the purpose, the ultimate goal is to write the undergraduate thesis or the postgraduate thesis, right? But when you're presenting expected research publication, then the panel will realize, okay, that this student is not going to stop by completing this thesis, right? But he or she hasn't planned to publish this paper as well. So therefore, you can include this expected research publications, right? Maybe a conference proceedings, maybe a policy brief in a magazine or a newspaper article, right? But more importantly, you can publish your research outcome as a research journal paper, right? So therefore, similar to this one, you can highlight, right, how many research papers that you are going to publish from the paper, from the thesis, and how many conference presentation that you are going to conduct, right? So therefore, especially this outline of the thesis and the expected research publications, right? Include these two slides into research presentation, then, right? Then the panel will clearly recognize this student has a very clear understanding about the research process. So therefore, this is important to include, right? Right. Then the time frame. The time frame indicates the research calendar, how we are going to plan, right, the scheduled time for the study to complete your research, right? Then here you don't need to rely definitely on this time frame. You can create your own time frame. Assume that you have 3 or 4 months, and then you can indicate the activities, maybe the proposal presentation, right? Then the write in the first chapter, write in the second chapter, data collection, data analysis, write in the third chapter, and so on. And accordingly, you can highlight the cages here, right? Align with the scheduled time period. And this time frame is needed for the research proposal presentation. Then the panel can understand clearly how we are going to execute your research plan during the scheduled time period, right? And ultimately, you have to include the references. The references which you have cited in the proposal presentation, right? When you are writing this reference list, make sure that you are aligned with the given guidelines by the department and the faculties, right? Different department, different faculties may have different outlines. Maybe someone using the APA styles and someone you can use the Harvard styles, right? So then clearly align with the guidelines provided and accordingly prepare the reference list, right? So therefore, this is important to provide the reference list, right? So I think so we have discussed all the key steps of the research proposal presentation. The purpose of this discussion is to provide some kind of comprehensive understand about how to prepare the research proposal presentation and how to present this proposal effectively, right? Because so then only you can convince to the panel members, right? So this research is worthwhile to conduct, right? So I think from this video, from this discussion, you'll be able to get something to prepare your research proposal presentation. And accordingly, you can prepare the proposal presentation, and then you can conduct the presentation, and then you can get your proposal confirmed and approved. Thank you very much for the attention.